There are mentors who change your career, mentors who change your life, and mentors who change everything you thought you knew about reality. Dr. Elizabeth Santos was supposed to be the first type. Last week, I discovered she was actually the third, and I'm starting to wish I'd never tried to find out why she only works night shifts. My name is Rachel Miller. For 3 years, I've been working as an emergency room nurse at Chicago Memorial Hospital. And for 3 years, Dr. Elizabeth Santos has been my mentor, my teacher, and honestly, my closest friend at this place. Elizabeth taught me everything I know about emergency medicine: how to read a patient's condition in the first 10 seconds, how to start an IV on someone in cardiac arrest, how to keep your hands steady when someone's life depends on your next move. She taught me that the difference between life and death in an ER isn't just medical knowledge. It's intuition, compassion, and the ability to make impossible decisions under pressure. Elizabeth has been my guide through every difficult case, every traumatic night, every moment when I questioned whether I was strong enough to do this job. But there was always something I couldn't quite figure out about Dr. Santos. She only worked night shifts. In 3 years, I had never seen her during the day. When I asked her about it, she would smile and say she was a creature of the night, that she preferred the quiet intensity of overnight emergency medicine. "The hospital feels different at night, Rachel," she would tell me. "The boundaries between life and death are thinner. You can feel when someone is truly fighting to stay alive." I thought she was being poetic. I thought she was just one of those doctors who preferred working when the hospital was calmer, when there were fewer administrators around, when it was just medical staff focused on saving lives. I never questioned why Elizabeth never attended day shift meetings. I never wondered why she never appeared in hospital newsletters or staff photos. I never thought it was strange that in 3 years of working together, we had never met for coffee outside the hospital. Elizabeth always said she was too busy with research, too focused on her cases, too tired after long night shifts to socialize during the day. What happened last Tuesday night shattered everything I thought I knew about my mentor, about my job, and about the very nature of reality. It started with a simple conversation. "Elizabeth," I said during a quiet moment around 3 a.m., "we should grab lunch sometime. Maybe this weekend?" Elizabeth looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Confusion mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Lunch?" she asked. "Yeah, outside the hospital. There's this great cafe downtown. We could actually talk without trauma alarms going off every 5 minutes. "Rachel, I don't think that would be possible." "Why not? You have to eat, right? You can't survive on hospital vending machine food forever." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up, her eyes seemed distant, almost sad. "Rachel, there are things about me that you don't understand. Things that make normal friendships complicated." "What do you mean?" "I mean that some people are meant to exist in specific places, at specific times, and some of us can't leave those boundaries." I thought she was talking about work-life balance, about being too dedicated to the job. I had no idea she was talking about something much more literal. The next morning, I decided to surprise Elizabeth. I would find out her schedule, figure out when she got off work, and convince her to get breakfast before going home. That's when I discovered that Dr. Elizabeth Santos doesn't exist. Not in any hospital database, not in any payroll system, not in any official record of Chicago Memorial Hospital staff. According to every computer system, every personnel file, every administrative record, Dr. Elizabeth Santos has never worked at Chicago Memorial Hospital. But I had been working beside her every night for 3 years. I had learned emergency medicine from someone who officially doesn't exist. And that was just the beginning of discovering what Dr. Elizabeth Santos really is. Before I tell you what I discovered about Dr. Elizabeth Santos, you need to understand exactly how impossible her non-existence is. For 3 years, Elizabeth and I worked side by side during every night shift. She wasn't a background figure or a casual acquaintance. She was my primary mentor, my teaching physician, the person who guided me through the most critical cases of my career. Elizabeth Santos appeared to be a trauma surgeon in her mid-40s with 20 years of emergency medicine experience. She had dark hair pulled back in a professional bun, sharp brown eyes that could assess a patient's condition instantly, and hands that moved with the precision of someone who had performed thousands of life-saving procedures. She knew every protocol, every medication, every piece of equipment in our ER. She could intubate a patient faster than anyone I'd ever seen. She could read an EKG in seconds and determine exactly what was wrong with someone's heart. More importantly, Elizabeth knew things about emergency medicine that you can't learn from textbooks. She taught me how to recognize when a patient was giving up hope and how to pull them back from the edge. She showed me how to communicate with families during the worst moments of their lives. She demonstrated how to make split-second decisions that mean the difference between life and death. Rachel, she would say, emergency medicine isn't just about medical knowledge. It's about connecting with people in their most vulnerable moments. You have to be willing to carry their fear so they can focus on surviving. Elizabeth had this way of calming panicked patients just by touching their hand and speaking in a low, steady voice. "You're going to be okay," she would tell them. "We're going to take care of you. Trust us." And patients did trust her. Even in the most chaotic trauma situations, when people were screaming and bleeding and terrified, Elizabeth could create this bubble of calm competence that made everyone believe they were going to survive. During my first year, I watched Elizabeth save lives that other doctors said were hopeless. A motorcycle accident victim with massive internal bleeding. Elizabeth performed emergency surgery right there in the trauma bay, her hands working inside the patient's chest while she calmly gave me instructions. "Suction here, Rachel. Apply pressure there. Watch his heart rate. If it drops below 60, start CPR immediately." The patient survived. He walked out of the hospital 2 weeks later. A 5-year-old girl who fell from a third-story window. Multiple skull fractures, brain swelling, internal injuries that should have been fatal. Elizabeth worked on her for 4 hours straight, never leaving her side, never giving up. "Children are fighters, Rachel," Elizabeth told me while we waited for the girl to stabilize. "They have this pure will to live that adults lose. Our job is to give that will every possible chance." The little girl made a complete recovery. A construction worker who was electrocuted and arrived with no heartbeat. Elizabeth performed CPR for 37 minutes while other staff members suggested calling time of death. "He's not ready to go," Elizabeth said, continuing chest compressions. "I can feel it. He's still fighting." The man's heart started beating again. He survived with no brain damage. Elizabeth had this intuition about patients that seemed almost supernatural. She could look at someone and know immediately whether they were going to make it or not. "Experience," she would tell me when I asked how she knew. "When you've seen as many people fight for their lives as I have, you learn to recognize the signs." But there was something else about Elizabeth's intuition that I couldn't quite explain. She seemed to know things about patients that weren't in their medical charts. Personal things. Family histories. Details about their lives that she couldn't have known from their hospital records. "Mrs. Johnson is worried about her cats," Elizabeth would say about an elderly patient who had never mentioned pets. "Mr. Williams is thinking about his daughter's wedding next month," she would observe about a heart attack patient who hadn't discussed family plans. "That young man is scared because he survived a car accident that killed his best friend," she would tell me about trauma victims who hadn't shared their accident details. When I asked Elizabeth how she knew these things, she would just smile. "People tell you more than you think they do, Rachel. You just have to listen with more than your ears." I thought she was just incredibly perceptive, gifted at reading people's emotions and body language. I never considered that she might be getting information from sources that had nothing to do with the living. Elizabeth and I worked together every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night. 12-hour shifts from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. For 3 years, that was our routine. During quiet moments, we would talk about medicine, about difficult cases, about the emotional challenges of emergency care. "Rachel, this job will break your heart regularly," Elizabeth told me during my second month. "You'll lose patients you desperately want to save. You'll watch families fall apart. You'll question whether you're strong enough to keep doing this. How do you deal with it? You remember that every life you save justifies the pain of the ones you lose. And you remember that being present during someone's most vulnerable moment is a privilege, even when you can't change the outcome." Elizabeth never talked about her life outside the hospital. She never mentioned family, friends, hobbies, or interests beyond medicine. "I live for this work," she would say, when I asked about her personal life. "Emergency medicine is my calling, my purpose. Everything else is secondary." I respected her dedication. I thought she was just one of those doctors who had devoted her entire life to saving others. I never wondered why she never received phone calls during our shifts. I never questioned why she never checked social media or talked about current events. I never found it strange that she seemed to exist only within the walls of Chicago Memorial Hospital. Until last Tuesday, when I decided to surprise her with breakfast and discovered that the person who had taught me everything I knew about emergency medicine didn't exist in any official capacity. That's when I started asking questions that I should have asked 3 years earlier. Questions about how someone could work in a hospital without appearing in personnel records. Questions about how someone could perform surgery without having a medical license on file. Questions about how someone could mentor me for 3 years while being completely invisible to every other hospital system. The answers to those questions changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. My investigation into Dr. Elizabeth Santos started innocently enough. I just wanted to find out her schedule so I could surprise her with breakfast after our night shift. Wednesday morning, after working with Elizabeth until 7 a.m., I went to the hospital's Human Resources Department. "Hi, I'm Rachel Miller from the ER. I need to check Dr. Santos's schedule for next week." The HR clerk, Janet Thompson, looked up from her computer with a confused expression. "Dr. Santos? I don't see anyone by that name in our system. What department?" "Emergency medicine. Dr. Elizabeth Santos. She's a trauma surgeon who works night shifts." Janet typed for several minutes, checking different databases. "I'm sorry, Rachel, but we don't have any record of a Dr. Elizabeth Santos employed by Chicago Memorial Hospital. Are you sure you have the name right?" "Of course I'm sure. I work with her 3 nights a week. She's been my mentor for 3 years. Rachel, I've been in HR for 12 years. I know every doctor in this hospital. There is no Dr. Elizabeth Santos on our staff. I thought there must be a computer error, a filing mistake, some kind of administrative confusion. Janet, can you check under different spellings? Maybe Santos with a different first name?" Janet spent 20 minutes searching every variation she could think of. Elizabeth Santos, Lisa Santos, Beth Santos, Liz Santos. "Rachel, there are no doctors with the last name Santos currently employed by this hospital. What about recently employed? Maybe she just started?" "I've checked our current staff, recent hires, contract employees, visiting physicians, and resident rotations. No Elizabeth Santos anywhere." I left HR feeling confused but not yet alarmed. Maybe Elizabeth was a consultant, or worked for a different hospital system, or had some kind of special arrangement that wouldn't show up in standard personnel records. That afternoon, I went to the hospital's payroll department. I need to verify employment information for Dr. Elizabeth Santos from emergency medicine. The payroll supervisor, Michael Rodriguez, looked at his computer and frowned. "We don't have anyone by that name receiving paychecks. Is this for a tax form or a verification letter?" "I just need to confirm that she works here." "Ma'am, if we're not cutting checks for someone, they don't work here in any official capacity." "But I work with her every night. She performs surgery, treats patients, makes medical decisions." Michael looked concerned. "Ma'am, anyone performing medical procedures in this hospital has to be credentialed, licensed, and on payroll. If someone is practicing medicine here without proper authorization, that's a serious legal issue." I left payroll feeling the first stirrings of real worry. That evening, I arrived for my night shift determined to get answers. At 7:15 p.m., Elizabeth appeared in the ER as usual, reviewing patient charts and preparing for the night ahead. "Elizabeth, I have a strange question. Are you technically employed by Chicago Memorial, or do you work for a different hospital system?" Elizabeth looked up from her charts with that same confused expression I'd seen the night before. "What do you mean, Rachel?" "I tried to check your schedule in HR today, and they said you don't exist in their system." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, then she smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Hospital bureaucracy, Rachel. Sometimes the paperwork takes a while to catch up with reality." "But you've been working here for years. How long does paperwork take?" "Rachel, some things about hospital administration are complicated. Let's focus on tonight's patients." Around 10 p.m. during a quiet period, I decided to test something. "Hey, Marcus," I called to Marcus Johnson, one of the other night shift nurses. "Can you ask Dr. Santos about the protocol for that chest trauma we had last week?" Marcus looked around the ER. Dr. Santos? Who's Dr. Santos? Elizabeth. Dr. Elizabeth Santos. She's right over there. I pointed to where Elizabeth was standing, reviewing an X-ray. Marcus followed my gaze, then looked back at me with concern. Rachel, there's nobody there. Are you feeling okay? I stared at Marcus, then looked back at Elizabeth. She was clearly visible, clearly present, clearly reviewing the X-ray with her usual focused concentration. Marcus, you don't see the woman in scrubs standing by the X-ray viewer? Rachel, there's no one by the X-ray viewer. It's just you and me in this section of the ER right now. I felt ice run through my veins. Marcus? Who performed the emergency thoracotomy on the stabbing victim last Thursday? You did, Rachel. You and Dr. Peterson worked on him together. What about Dr. Santos? She was the lead surgeon. Marcus looked genuinely worried now. Rachel, Dr. Peterson was the attending physician on that case. You assisted him. There was no Dr. Santos involved. But I remember her clearly. She guided me through the procedure. She taught me how to... Rachel, Dr. Peterson told me you did an excellent job assisting him. He said you had great instincts for someone with only 3 years of experience. When I excused myself and went to the hospital's security office. I need to check badge access records for Dr. Elizabeth Santos. The security guard pulled up the access system. What's her employee ID number? I don't know. Can you search by name? The guard typed for several minutes. No access records for anyone named Elizabeth Santos. No badge has been issued to that name. But she works here. She uses badge access to get into restricted areas. Ma'am, if someone is accessing restricted areas without a badge, that's a major security violation. When did you observe this? Every night. She goes everywhere in the hospital. The guard looked serious. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to point out this person the next time you see them so we can investigate this security breach. When I returned to the ER, Elizabeth was exactly where I'd left her, now treating a patient with chest pain. Elizabeth, can you come here for a moment? Elizabeth approached me with her usual warm smile. What is it, Rachel? I looked around the ER. 3 other staff members were within sight. Marcus, Dr. Peterson, and Linda, the unit clerk. Elizabeth, wave at Marcus. Elizabeth looked confused but raised her hand and waved toward Marcus. Marcus continued his work, showing no acknowledgement that anyone had waved at him. Elizabeth, call out Dr. Peterson's name. Dr. Peterson, Elizabeth called clearly. Dr. Peterson didn't turn around, didn't respond, showed no indication that he had heard anything. Rachel, why are they ignoring me? Elizabeth asked, now looking hurt and confused. Elizabeth, I don't think they can see or hear you. What do you mean? I mean that I think you and I can interact, but no one else in this hospital can see you. Elizabeth stared at me with growing alarm. Rachel, that's impossible. I work here. I treat patients. I perform surgery. Elizabeth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. When was the last time you left this hospital? Elizabeth thought for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. I don't remember. When was the last time you went home? Elizabeth's confusion deepened. I stay. Rachel, I don't understand the question. Elizabeth, where do you live? What's your address? Elizabeth opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. She tried again, then looked at me with genuine fear. Rachel, I can't remember. I know I have a home. I know I have a life outside this hospital, but I can't remember any details. Elizabeth, what year is it? It's 2024. What year did you start working at Chicago Memorial? Elizabeth was quiet for a very long time. I remember being here for a long time. I remember training residents, teaching nurses, working countless night shifts. But Rachel, I can't remember when I started. Elizabeth, what's the last thing you remember clearly from outside this hospital? Elizabeth concentrated intensely, her face showing increasing distress. I remember I was driving home after a very long shift. There had been a mass casualty event, multiple trauma cases. I was exhausted. It was raining heavily. What happened next? I don't remember. The next clear memory I have is being back here, working another night shift. I felt my heart pounding as the impossible truth started to crystallize. Elizabeth, what kind of car were you driving? A blue Honda Civic, 2003 model. Elizabeth, do you remember what you were wearing that night? Scrubs. These scrubs. Elizabeth looked down at her hospital outfit. I was wearing exactly what I'm wearing now. I realized with growing horror that in 3 years of working together, I had never seen Elizabeth in different clothes. She always wore the same scrubs, the same shoes, the same hair tie. Elizabeth, have you ever changed clothes in the 3 years I've known you? Elizabeth looked down at herself, then back at me, her eyes now filled with terror. Rachel, what's happening to me? Why can't I remember leaving the hospital? Why can't anyone else see me? What am I? I knew I had to find answers before Elizabeth's growing panic affected her ability to work, before her presence in the ER became dangerous to patients, and before my own sanity collapsed under the weight of an impossible truth. I had been mentored for 3 years by someone who appeared to be trapped in this hospital, unable to leave, unable to be seen by anyone but me, and unable to remember anything about her life outside these walls. The question was no longer whether Elizabeth Santos existed in hospital records. The question was whether Elizabeth Santos existed at all. That night, after Elizabeth and I finished our shift, I stayed at the hospital to research what I was beginning to suspect was impossible. If Elizabeth Santos didn't exist in any current hospital records, maybe she existed in historical records. I went to the hospital's archive room in the basement, where personnel files from previous decades were stored in file cabinets and digital databases. I started searching for Elizabeth Santos in employment records from 2020, 2015, 2010, working backward year by year. Nothing. Then I found something that made my blood freeze. In the 2004 personnel files, there was a complete employee record for Dr. Elizabeth Santos, emergency medicine physician, hired in 1989, 15 years of exemplary service, multiple commendations for outstanding patient care, awards for teaching and mentoring junior staff, and then, in December 2004, a death certificate. Dr. Elizabeth Santos had died in a car accident on December 15, 2004, at 7:47 a.m., while driving home from a night shift at Chicago Memorial Hospital. According to the police report attached to her file, Dr. Santos had been working a double shift during a mass casualty event, a multi-car pileup on I-94 that had brought 16 trauma cases to the ER in one night. After working for 18 consecutive hours, Elizabeth had driven home in heavy rain. Her car skidded on a wet overpass and crashed into a concrete barrier. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The file included a photo of Dr. Elizabeth Santos from her 2004 hospital ID badge. It was exactly the same woman I had been working with for 3 years. Same face, same hair, same eyes, same expression of calm competence. But according to this death certificate, Dr. Elizabeth Santos had died 20 years ago. I photographed the entire file with my phone, then continued searching through the archives. In the hospital newsletter from January 2005, I found a memorial article about Dr. Santos. Chicago Memorial Hospital mourns the loss of Dr. Elizabeth Santos, who died tragically on December 15, 2004. Dr. Santos was beloved by colleagues and patients alike for her exceptional skill, compassion, and dedication to emergency medicine. She was particularly known for her ability to mentor young medical professionals and her intuitive understanding of patient care. Dr. Santos will be remembered as a physician who truly embodied the healing spirit of our profession. The article included testimonials from nurses and doctors who had worked with Elizabeth. Dr. Santos taught me that emergency medicine isn't just about technical skills, it's about connecting with people in their most vulnerable moments. Nurse Patricia Williams. Elizabeth had this amazing ability to know exactly what patients needed, even when they couldn't communicate it themselves. Dr. Michael Chen. She saved more lives than we could count, and she taught all of us how to be better caregivers. Nurse David Rodriguez. The testimonials sounded exactly like what Elizabeth had taught me, but these people were talking about her in the past tense, 20 years ago. I found more disturbing information in the hospital's incident reports from December 2004. The mass casualty event that had kept Elizabeth at the hospital for 18 hours was the same type of emergency she had mentioned during our conversation earlier that night. Multiple trauma cases, exhausted medical staff, Elizabeth working through the night to save as many lives as possible. According to the incident report, Dr. Santos had been in the middle of performing emergency surgery on a critically injured patient when her shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m. Dr. Santos refused to leave the hospital until all trauma cases were stabilized, the report noted. She continued working despite extreme fatigue, stating that she could not abandon patients who were still fighting for their lives. The patient Elizabeth had been treating when she should have gone home was a 23-year-old construction worker named James Morrison, who had suffered massive internal injuries in the multi-car accident. Dr. Santos had worked on James for 4 hours, performing complex emergency surgery to repair damaged organs and stop internal bleeding. James Morrison had survived. According to the follow-up report, Elizabeth had finally left the hospital at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes after her shift had officially ended, only after confirming that James Morrison was stable and would recover. She had died in the car accident 17 minutes later. James Morrison had lived because Elizabeth Santos had refused to leave until she was certain he would survive. And Elizabeth Santos had died because she had stayed to save his life. As I read through these records, I realized something that made my heart pound with a mixture of fear and sadness. The last patient Elizabeth had treated before her death, James Morrison, had been saved by emergency procedures that were identical to techniques Elizabeth had taught me over the past 3 years. The same surgical approaches, the same monitoring protocols, the same intuitive understanding of trauma medicine. Elizabeth had been teaching me the exact methods she had used to save her final patient. I decided to research what had happened to the other staff members who had worked with Elizabeth in 2004. Most had retired, transferred to other hospitals, or moved away from Chicago over the past 20 years. But I found contact information for Patricia Williams, the nurse who had written one of the memorial testimonials. I called her that afternoon. Ms. Williams, this is Rachel Miller from Chicago Memorial Hospital. I'm researching the history of our emergency medicine department, and I found your testimonial about Dr. Elizabeth Santos from 2005. Oh my goodness, Elizabeth Santos. I haven't thought about her in years. She was an incredible physician. Such a tragedy when she died. Ms. Williams, can you tell me about working with Dr. Santos? Elizabeth was special. She had this gift for teaching, for helping young nurses learn how to handle emergency situations. She would work with you personally, show you techniques that you couldn't learn from textbooks. What kind of techniques? How to read patients' conditions intuitively. How to anticipate what they needed before they could ask for it. How to stay calm during chaos and make decisions that saved lives. Ms. Williams, did Dr. Santos ever mention anything unusual about her work? Anything that seemed supernatural? Patricia was quiet for a moment. You know, there was something. Elizabeth always seemed to know things about patients that weren't in their charts. Personal details, family situations, emotional needs. When I asked her how she knew these things, she would say she could feel what patients were experiencing. Did other staff members notice this? Some did. But Elizabeth was so skilled, so knowledgeable, that we just assumed she was incredibly perceptive. We never questioned her methods because her results were extraordinary. Ms. Williams, did you ever see Dr. Santos after December 2004? After she died? Of course not. Why would you ask that? Just curious about whether anyone reported unusual experiences after her death. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Actually, now that you mention it, there were some strange stories. Nurses who worked night shifts in the months after Elizabeth died said they sometimes felt like she was still there. They would sense someone helping them during difficult cases, or feel like they were getting guidance that sounded like Elizabeth's voice. Did anyone report actually seeing her? A few nurses claimed they saw someone who looked like Elizabeth during night shifts, but administration dismissed those reports as grief reactions or stress hallucinations. What happened to those nurses? Most of them transferred to other departments or left the hospital entirely. Working night shifts in the ER became difficult for people who had been close to Elizabeth. After I hung up with Patricia Williams, I searched for more information about post-2004 staff changes in the emergency department. What I found was a pattern that made me realize I wasn't the first nurse to encounter Elizabeth's spirit. Between 2005 and 2024, 7 different nurses had worked night shifts in the ER and then abruptly transferred to other departments or left Chicago Memorial entirely. All 7 had filed incident reports about unusual experiences during night shifts. All 7 had mentioned feeling like they were receiving guidance from someone who wasn't visible to other staff members. 3 of the 7 had specifically mentioned seeing a woman who matched Elizabeth Santos's description. All of the reports had been dismissed by administration as stress-related hallucinations, but now I realized what had really happened. Elizabeth Santos had been appearing to night shift nurses for 20 years, trying to continue her work as a mentor and teacher. But most nurses couldn't handle the psychological stress of interacting with someone who shouldn't exist. I was apparently the first nurse who had been able to maintain a relationship with Elizabeth's spirit for an extended period. The question was why? Why could I see Elizabeth when most people couldn't? Why was I able to interact with her naturally while other nurses were traumatized by the experience? And most importantly, what did Elizabeth's spirit need from me that she hadn't been able to get from the previous nurses who had encountered her? That evening, when I returned for another night shift, I looked at Elizabeth with completely different eyes. She appeared exactly as usual, calm, competent, focused on patient care. But now I knew that I was looking at the spirit of a woman who had died 20 years ago, who had been trying to continue her work as a healer and teacher from beyond death. "Elizabeth," I said during a quiet moment, "we need to talk." "About what, Rachel?" "About December 15th, 2004. Elizabeth's face went completely pale. She stared at me with an expression of pure terror. "Rachel, why would you mention that date?" "Because that's the day you died, Elizabeth. That's the day you crashed your car driving home from this hospital after working 18 hours to save James Morrison's life." Elizabeth sat down heavily, her hands shaking. "Rachel, that's not... I remember that night, but I didn't die. I'm here. I'm talking to you." "Elizabeth, you've been dead for 20 years. You're a spirit, a ghost, trapped in this hospital. That's why no one else can see you. That's why you don't exist in any current records. That's why you can't remember leaving this place." Elizabeth looked at her hands, then around the ER, then back at me. "If I'm dead, Rachel, then what am I doing here? Why am I still working? Why can I still treat patients?" "I don't know, Elizabeth, but I think there's something you need to finish. Something that's keeping you trapped here. And I think I'm supposed to help you figure out what it is." Elizabeth was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the reality of her situation began to sink in. "Rachel, if I'm dead, then all the patients I've helped you save over the past 3 years, did I actually help them, or were you doing all the work alone?" It was a question I wasn't ready to answer. Because if Elizabeth was a spirit who could only be seen by me, then either she had somehow been helping me save lives from beyond death, or I had been hallucinating my mentor for 3 years and somehow developing exceptional medical skills on my own. Both possibilities were terrifying, but I was about to discover that the truth was more complex and more frightening than either of those explanations. After Elizabeth realized she was dead, her spiritual presence in the hospital began to change in ways that terrified both of us. The night after our conversation about December 15th, 2004, Elizabeth appeared more translucent than usual. I could see through her to the wall behind her, and her voice had a distant, echoing quality. But more disturbing were the effects her emotional distress was having on the hospital itself. During our shift, medical equipment began malfunctioning whenever Elizabeth was nearby. Heart monitors would show flatline readings even when patients were stable. IV pumps would stop working. Ventilators would alarm for no apparent reason. "Rachel," whispered Dr. Peterson during a code blue, "all our equipment is going haywire tonight. I've never seen anything like this." I knew it was Elizabeth's presence affecting the machinery, but I couldn't explain that to Dr. Peterson without sounding insane. Around 2 a.m., while treating a car accident victim, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about Elizabeth's spirit. The patient, a 30-year-old woman named Sarah Collins, had massive internal bleeding and was going into shock. Dr. Peterson was preparing for emergency surgery when Sarah suddenly sat up on the gurney. "Dr. Santos," Sarah said clearly, looking directly at Elizabeth. Thank you for staying with me. Dr. Sinaner. Peterson and I stared at Sarah in confusion. Ma'am, there's no Dr. Santos here. Dr. Peterson said gently. You're in shock. Try to lie still. But Sarah continued looking at Elizabeth. You told me my daughter is safe. You said the babysitter got her out of the car before the crash. Elizabeth hadn't spoken to Sarah at all during our treatment. But somehow Sarah was receiving information from Elizabeth that turned out to be accurate. Her daughter had indeed been rescued safely from the accident. Sarah, I asked carefully, what does Dr. Santos look like? Dark hair, kind eyes, wearing scrubs. She's standing right next to you. Dr. Peterson looked where Sarah was pointing and saw nothing. But Sarah could see Elizabeth, just as clearly as I could. After we stabilized Sarah and sent her to surgery, I realized something horrifying. Elizabeth's spirit was becoming stronger, more visible to patients who were close to death. Over the next few hours, 3 more critical patients spoke directly to Elizabeth, thanking her for comfort she had apparently provided while they were unconscious. A heart attack victim said Elizabeth had told him his wife was on her way to the hospital. A stroke patient claimed Elizabeth had explained that his confusion was temporary and he would recover his speech. A teenage overdose case insisted that Elizabeth had convinced her not to give up fighting. All of these patients had received accurate information and emotional support from Elizabeth, while other staff members saw and heard nothing. Rachel, Elizabeth said during a break, I think I'm becoming more connected to patients who are dying. What do you mean? I can sense their fear, their pain, their thoughts. When someone is close to death, the boundary between life and death becomes thin enough for me to communicate with them. Elizabeth, that's terrifying. Why? Because it means you're not just a trapped spirit. You're becoming some kind of bridge between the living and the dead. That's when Elizabeth told me something that made my blood freeze. Rachel, I'm not the only one. What do you mean? There are other spirits in this hospital, other doctors and nurses who died while working here. I've been seeing them more clearly since you helped me realize I was dead. Elizabeth pointed toward the trauma bay. Dr. Richard Morrison died of a heart attack in 1987 while performing emergency surgery. He's still here, still trying to finish that operation. She gestured toward the medication room. Nurse Linda Chen died in a car accident in 1995. She still comes to work every night, checking on patients, making sure their medications are correct. How many others? I count at least 12 spirits of medical staff who died while working at Chicago Memorial. All of them are trapped here, trying to continue their work. As Elizabeth spoke, I began to see them. Translucent figures in outdated medical uniforms, moving through the ER, interacting with equipment that couldn't be affected by their touch, caring for patients who couldn't see them. Elizabeth, why can I suddenly see all of them? Because your connection to me has opened your perception to the spiritual realm. You're becoming sensitive to the presence of the dead. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, Rachel, but I think it means you have a choice to make. What choice? You can either help us find peace and move on from this hospital, or you can become like us, trapped between life and death, unable to leave, unable to rest. That night, as I watched a dozen dead medical professionals continuing to work alongside the living staff who couldn't see them, I realized the true horror of my situation. Chicago Memorial Hospital wasn't just a place where people came to heal. It was a place where dedicated medical professionals became so devoted to saving lives that they couldn't stop working even after death. And I was becoming the bridge between their world and ours. Elizabeth, what do you need to find peace? I need to save my last patient. But James Morrison survived. You did save your last patient. Elizabeth shook her head sadly. Rachel, James Morrison wasn't my last patient. What do you mean? The night I died, after I finished with James, one more patient came in. A little girl, maybe 7 years old. Critical injuries from the same accident. I started working on her, but I never got to finish. What happened? My shift ended. I was exhausted. I decided to let the day shift team take over her care. Elizabeth started crying again. Rachel, that little girl died 2 hours after I left the hospital. If I had stayed, if I had finished treating her, she would have lived. How do you know that? Because I've been replaying that night for 20 years. I know exactly what she needed, exactly what procedures would have saved her life. But I chose to go home instead of finishing what I started. Elizabeth, who was the little girl? Her name was Emma Martinez, 7 years old. She died because I abandoned her. As Elizabeth spoke Emma's name, the temperature in the ER dropped 20 degrees. Medical equipment throughout the hospital began alarming simultaneously. Every light in the building flickered, and in the trauma bay where Elizabeth was standing, a small, translucent figure appeared. A little girl in a hospital gown, looking exactly as she would have 20 years ago, staring directly at Elizabeth with eyes full of sadness and confusion. "Dr. Santos," the little girl said in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "Why did you leave me?" Elizabeth fell to her knees, sobbing. "Emma, I'm so sorry. I should have stayed. I should have saved you." "I waited for you to come back," Emma said, "but you never came back." That's when I realized that Elizabeth wasn't just trapped by her own guilt. She was trapped by the spirit of the patient she had failed to save. And until Elizabeth could somehow complete the medical care that Emma needed 20 years ago, both spirits would remain trapped in Chicago Memorial Hospital. The question was, how do you perform life-saving medical procedures on someone who has been dead for 2 decades? And what happens to the living when the dead refuse to let go of their unfinished business? The appearance of Emma Martinez's spirit changed everything about Elizabeth's presence in the hospital. Emma didn't just appear once and disappear. She remained visible, following Elizabeth through the ER, asking the same heartbreaking question over and over. "Dr. Santos, why did you leave me?" Elizabeth tried to explain. "Emma, I was exhausted. I had been working for 18 hours. I thought the day shift doctors could take care of you." "But you promised you would fix me," Emma replied in her small, distant voice. "You said you were going to make me better." "I tried, sweetheart. I did everything I could." "No, you didn't. You left before you finished." The conversation was devastating to watch, but it was also affecting the entire hospital in supernatural ways. Every time Emma spoke, hospital equipment would malfunction. Lights would flicker throughout the building. The temperature would drop to freezing in whatever room she appeared in. Other patients began reporting strange experiences. "Nurse, there's a little girl in my room who won't stop crying," complained Mrs. Anderson, a post-operative patient. "That child keeps asking me if I've seen her doctor," said Mr. Williams, a heart attack patient. "She seems lost." The living patients could see Emma, just as they could see Elizabeth when they were close to death. But unlike Elizabeth, who provided comfort, Emma's presence was disturbing and frightening. She would appear in patient rooms, asking if they had seen Dr. Santos. When they couldn't help her, she would become agitated, causing medical equipment to spark and fail. "Rachel," Dr. Peterson pulled me aside during a particularly chaotic night. "We're having system-wide equipment failures. Maintenance can't find any mechanical problems, but we're losing monitors, ventilators, and IV pumps throughout the hospital." "Maybe it's electrical interference?" "From what? And why is it only happening during night shifts?" "Day shift reports no equipment problems at all." I knew the answer, but I couldn't explain that the hospital was being haunted by the spirits of a doctor and patient trapped in an unfinished medical emergency from 20 years ago. Elizabeth's emotional state was deteriorating rapidly. She was losing her ability to focus on current patients because she was consumed with guilt about Emma. "Rachel, I have to fix this," Elizabeth said during a break. "I have to find a way to complete Emma's treatment." "Elizabeth, Emma died 20 years ago. There's no medical treatment that can help her now." "But what if there is? What if the reason we're both trapped here is because her medical emergency is still ongoing in some supernatural way?" "What do you mean?" "What if time works differently for spirits? What if Emma is still in the same critical condition she was in 20 years ago, still waiting for me to finish saving her life?" Elizabeth's theory was impossible, but it was the only explanation that made sense of what we were experiencing. "Elizabeth, what treatment did Emma need that you didn't provide?" "She had massive internal bleeding from a ruptured spleen and liver damage. I had stopped the bleeding and stabilized her, but she needed immediate surgery to repair the organ damage." "What kind of surgery?" "Splenectomy and liver repair. Complex procedures, but definitely survivable if performed quickly." "Elizabeth, you can't perform surgery on a dead spirit." What if I can? What if the supernatural realm allows for medical interventions that aren't possible in the physical world? That night, Elizabeth attempted something that challenged every law of medicine and physics. In Trauma Bay 3, where Emma's spirit appeared most frequently, Elizabeth began preparing for surgery. She gathered spiritual versions of surgical instruments, tools that appeared translucent, but seemed real in her hands. She prepared an operating area using equipment that only she and I could see. Rachel, I need you to assist me. Elizabeth, this is insane. You can't operate on a ghost. Rachel, I've been a surgeon for over 30 years, including 20 years as a spirit. I think I understand the capabilities of supernatural medicine better than you do. Emma appeared on the spiritual operating table, looking exactly as she would have 20 years ago, a 7-year-old girl with critical internal injuries. Dr. Santos, Emma said, are you going to fix me now? Yes, sweetheart. I'm going to finish what I started. Elizabeth began the operation, working with instruments that existed only in the spiritual realm. I watched in amazement as she performed procedures on Emma's spirit that seemed to have real effects. As Elizabeth worked, Emma's expression changed from pain and confusion to relief and gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Santos. I feel better now. You're going to be fine, Emma. You're going to be just fine. But something went wrong during the spiritual surgery. As Elizabeth completed the final procedures, both spirits began to fade more rapidly than usual. Rachel, Elizabeth said weakly, something's happening. I think this is how we move on. Move on to where? I don't know, but I can feel myself being pulled away from this hospital, away from the physical world. Emma was also becoming more translucent. Dr. Santos, am I going to see my mommy now? Yes, Emma. You're going to see your family. You're going to be safe and happy. But as the spirits prepared to move on to whatever comes after death, I realized something horrifying. Over the past 3 years, Elizabeth had taught me everything I knew about emergency medicine. All of my medical knowledge, all of my surgical skills, all of my ability to save lives had come from learning from her spirit. If Elizabeth moved on to the afterlife, would I lose all of the medical abilities she had taught me? Would I suddenly become an incompetent nurse who couldn't remember how to perform basic emergency procedures? Elizabeth, wait. Before you go, I need to know. What happens to my medical knowledge when you're gone? Elizabeth looked at me with sad understanding. Rachel, the knowledge I gave you came from my spirit. When I move on, you'll retain what you truly learned and understood, but you'll lose the supernatural intuition I provided. What does that mean? It means you'll be a good nurse with 3 years of experience, but you won't have the instinctive understanding of emergency medicine that came from my decades of spiritual knowledge. Elizabeth, I don't think I can do this job without your guidance. Rachel, you're stronger than you think. But I need to tell you something important before I go. What? You have a choice. You can let me move on and continue your career as a normal nurse. Or what? Or you can come with us. You can die and become a spirit and continue learning supernatural medicine as part of the dead medical staff that works in this hospital. I stared at Elizabeth in horror. You're asking me to kill myself to become a ghost nurse? I'm offering you the chance to continue our work together, to learn medical techniques that transcend the physical world, to save lives in ways that living doctors never could. Elizabeth, that's insane. Is it? Rachel, in 3 years working with me, how many lives have you saved using supernatural knowledge? How many patients have survived because you had access to medical wisdom from beyond death? I realized that Elizabeth was right. My success rate as a nurse had been extraordinary. I had saved patients that other medical professionals said were hopeless. I had performed procedures that should have been beyond my experience level, all because I had been learning from a spirit with decades of medical knowledge. Elizabeth, what happens if I choose to stay alive? You'll be a competent nurse, but you'll lose the ability to see spirits, to access supernatural medical knowledge, to perform miracle saves. And what happens if I choose to die? You'll become part of the supernatural medical team that works in this hospital. You'll continue learning from spirits who have been practicing medicine for decades or centuries. You'll be able to save lives in ways that living doctors never could. As Elizabeth and Emma continued to fade, other dead medical staff appeared around them, Dr. Richard Morrison, who had died of a heart attack in 1987, Nurse Linda Chen, who had died in a car accident in 1995, 8 other spirits of doctors and nurses who had died while working at Chicago Memorial, all of them looking at me with hopeful expressions, all of them waiting to see if I would choose to join their supernatural medical practice. Rachel, Dr. Morrison said, we could teach you surgical techniques that have been perfected over decades of spiritual practice. You could learn to diagnose conditions by sensing patients' spiritual energy, added Nurse Chen. You could save lives that are impossible to save using only physical medicine, said another spirit. Elizabeth was almost completely translucent now. Rachel, I have to go. Emma needs me to help her find her family in the afterlife, but you have to decide. Do you want to remain among the living, or do you want to join us among the dead? I looked around the ER at the equipment failures, the chaos, the supernatural disturbances that had been escalating since Elizabeth's presence became stronger. I thought about the patients I had saved using Elizabeth's guidance, and the patients I might not be able to save without her supernatural assistance. I thought about the choice between a normal nursing career and a supernatural medical practice that could save lives in impossible ways. But I also thought about the fact that choosing to die would mean abandoning my life, my family, my future among the living. Elizabeth, I said finally, I need more time to decide. Rachel, we can't wait. Emma and I are being pulled into the afterlife now. If you're going to join us, it has to be now. The other dead medical staff were also starting to fade. Choose quickly, Rachel, Dr. Morrison urged. This opportunity won't come again. I realized I had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether I lived or died, whether I remained human or became a spirit, whether I practiced normal medicine or supernatural healing. The choice that would define the rest of my existence was happening in real time, with no chance to reconsider, no opportunity to change my mind. Elizabeth, I said, my answer is... Elizabeth, I said, my answer is no. I choose to stay alive. The moment I spoke those words, Elizabeth's expression changed from hope to devastating sadness. Rachel, are you sure? This is your only chance to continue learning supernatural medicine. I'm sure, Elizabeth. I need to live my life, not abandon it to become a ghost. Elizabeth nodded with understanding, but the other dead medical staff looked angry and disappointed. She's making a mistake, Dr. Morrison said coldly. Living medicine is limited, ineffective. She could save so many more lives as one of us. She's choosing ignorance over enlightenment, Nurse Chen added bitterly, but Elizabeth silenced them. Rachel is making the choice that's right for her. We have to respect that. As Elizabeth and Emma prepared to move on to the afterlife, something unexpected happened. The other dead medical staff didn't fade away with them. Instead, they became more solid, more visible, more present in the ER. Dr. Morrison, I said, aren't you moving on too? Dr. Morrison smiled in a way that made my blood freeze. Rachel, Elizabeth, and Emma are moving on because they completed their unfinished business. The rest of us are staying because our work here isn't finished. What work? Converting living medical staff to join our supernatural practice. You were supposed to be our first success, but since you chose to remain alive, we'll have to find other candidates. I realized with growing horror that I had stumbled into something much more sinister than I had understood. The dead medical staff weren't just trapped spirits trying to continue their healing work. They were actively recruiting living doctors and nurses to die and join their supernatural medical practice. Rachel, Nurse Chen said with a predatory smile, you may have chosen to stay alive today, but we'll be watching you. Every mistake you make, every patient you lose, every time your limited living medicine fails, we'll be there to remind you that you could have saved them if you had joined us. Are you threatening me? We're offering you ongoing opportunities to reconsider your decision, Dr. Morrison replied. And we're going to make sure you understand the consequences of relying on inferior living medicine instead of superior supernatural healing. Elizabeth looked horrified. That's not what our purpose should be. We're supposed to heal, not manipulate. Elizabeth, you're moving on to the afterlife, Dr. Morrison said dismissively. You don't understand the responsibility we have to expand supernatural medicine by recruiting the best living practitioners. As Elizabeth and Emma faded away completely, moving on to whatever comes after death, The remaining dead medical staff began to reveal their true nature. They weren't benevolent spirits trying to continue healing. They were supernatural entities that had become addicted to the power of practicing medicine beyond the limitations of physical reality. They wanted to build an army of dead medical professionals who could save lives that living doctors couldn't save, but only by convincing living doctors and nurses to kill themselves. "Rachel," Dr. Morrison said, "let us show you what you're missing by choosing to remain alive." Over the next few hours, as I continued my shift, the dead medical staff began demonstrating their supernatural medical abilities. When a heart attack patient arrived who was clearly dying, Dr. Morrison performed spiritual surgery that somehow stabilized the patient's condition beyond what living medicine could achieve. When a car accident victim came in with injuries that should have been fatal, Nurse Chen used supernatural healing techniques that repaired damage that shouldn't have been survivable. When a child arrived with a condition that living doctors said was hopeless, the dead medical staff worked together to heal the child, using spiritual medicine that transcended physical limitations. Each supernatural intervention saved a life that would have been lost using only living medicine. But each intervention also came with psychological pressure directed at me. "Rachel, that heart attack patient would have died if you had been working alone," Dr. Morrison pointed out. "But because we intervened, he'll live to see his grandchildren grow up." "That car accident victim would have been paralyzed permanently using living medicine," Nurse Chen added. "But our supernatural healing gave him a complete recovery." "That child would have died a slow, painful death from her condition," another dead nurse said. "But we cured her completely using spiritual medicine that you could access if you joined us." The message was clear. I could save more lives as a dead spirit than I ever could as a living nurse. But I was also seeing the psychological manipulation and predatory behavior of the dead medical staff. They were using patients' lives as emotional weapons to pressure me into committing suicide. They were demonstrating supernatural medical abilities specifically to make me feel inadequate and guilty about my limitations as a living practitioner. They were creating medical emergencies that only they could solve, then offering those solutions as evidence that I should kill myself to join them. "I'm not falling for this," I told Dr. Morrison during a break. "You're manipulating me using patients' lives. Rachel, we're showing you the reality of medical practice. Living medicine is limited and often ineffective. Supernatural medicine can achieve results that physical medicine never could, but at the cost of doctors and nurses killing themselves to access those abilities. Death is a transition, not an ending. As a spirit, you would continue practicing medicine at a level that transcends human limitations." "And what about my life, my family, my future?" "Temporary attachments to a temporary existence. Medical practice is eternal. Healing is forever." As the dead medical staff continued their recruitment pressure, I realized they had been doing this for decades. Every nurse who had worked night shifts and then transferred away or left the hospital, they had encountered this same pressure to kill themselves and join the supernatural medical practice. Most had chosen to leave rather than face the ongoing psychological manipulation, but a few had made the other choice. "How many living medical staff have you convinced to kill themselves?" I asked Dr. Morrison directly. "Over the past 30 years, we've gained 7 new members who chose to transition from living practice to supernatural practice." "You've convinced 7 people to commit suicide?" "We've offered 7 people the opportunity to transcend the limitations of living medicine and join a supernatural healing practice that saves lives impossible to save otherwise. That's murder by manipulation. That's recruitment for a higher level of medical service." I realized that the dead medical staff had been running a decades-long campaign to build their supernatural medical practice by psychologically pressuring living doctors and nurses to kill themselves. They used guilt, medical emergencies, and demonstrations of superior supernatural abilities to make living practitioners feel inadequate and responsible for deaths they could have prevented by joining the dead. "I'm going to stop you," I told Dr. Morrison. "How?" "You're one living nurse against 11 supernatural medical practitioners with decades of spiritual power." "I'll find a way." "Rachel, you don't understand what you're dealing with. We can make your life as a living nurse impossible. We can cause equipment failures during critical procedures. We can create medical emergencies that you can't solve. We can make you watch patients die knowing that we could have saved them if you had joined us. Then I'll expose what you're doing." "To whom?" Who would believe that dead doctors are recruiting living medical staff to commit suicide? You'll sound insane. Dr. Morrison was right. I couldn't report supernatural manipulation to hospital administration or law enforcement. But I could find another way to stop the dead medical staff from continuing their recruitment campaign. I could find a way to force them to move on to the afterlife, just as Elizabeth and Emma had done. The question was, how do you perform spiritual exorcism on dead medical professionals who are using their supernatural abilities to manipulate the living? And how do you do it before they convince other living doctors and nurses to kill themselves to join their supernatural practice? As my shift ended and the dead medical staff continued their psychological pressure campaign, I realized that my choice to remain alive had started a war between the living and the dead for the soul of medical practice itself. A war I had to win. Or Chicago Memorial Hospital would become a recruitment center for supernatural medicine that required medical professionals to die to access its power. The stakes weren't just my life anymore. The stakes were the lives of every medical professional who would work at this hospital in the future. And the dead medical staff had decades of supernatural power, manipulation experience, and spiritual abilities that I couldn't match as a living human. But I had something they didn't have: the ability to leave the hospital, to research solutions in the outside world, and to find help from people who weren't trapped in the supernatural realm. The battle for Chicago Memorial Hospital was about to begin. The war between the living and the dead at Chicago Memorial Hospital lasted 3 months and cost me everything I thought I knew about medicine, reality, and the price of healing. After my confrontation with the dead medical staff, I left the hospital that morning knowing I could never return to normal nursing practice. But I also knew I couldn't abandon the hospital to supernatural entities that were manipulating living medical professionals into committing suicide. I spent the next week researching spiritual intervention, exorcism, and methods for helping trapped spirits move on to the afterlife. What I discovered was both hopeful and terrifying. According to multiple sources on supernatural intervention, spirits that become manipulative and predatory can be forced to move on through a process called spiritual confrontation, but only if they're presented with irrefutable evidence that their manipulation is causing more harm than their supernatural abilities are preventing. The dead medical staff at Chicago Memorial believed they were justified in recruiting living professionals because their supernatural medicine could save lives that living medicine couldn't save. To force them to move on, I needed to prove that their recruitment methods were causing more deaths than their supernatural interventions were preventing. I started by researching the 7 medical professionals who had killed themselves to join the dead medical staff over the past 30 years. Dr. Sarah Williams, emergency physician, suicide by overdose in 1995. Nurse Michael Torres, trauma specialist, suicide by hanging in 2001. Dr. James Chen, surgeon, suicide by car crash in 2007. Nurse Patricia Rodriguez, pediatric specialist, suicide by drowning in 2012. Dr. David Kim, cardiologist, suicide by gunshot in 2016. Nurse Linda Martinez, anesthesiologist, suicide by drug overdose in 2019. Dr. Robert Johnson, trauma surgeon, suicide by jumping from hospital roof in 2022. Each suicide had occurred after the individual had worked night shifts and reported unusual experiences with supernatural presences. Each individual had been highly skilled, dedicated medical professionals with excellent patient outcomes. But what I discovered when I researched their personal lives was devastating. Dr. Sarah Williams had left behind 2 young children who grew up without a mother. Nurse Michael Torres had been the primary caregiver for his elderly parents, who had to be placed in a nursing home after his death. Dr. James Chen had been in the middle of developing a new surgical technique that could have saved thousands of lives if he had lived to complete his research. Nurse Patricia Rodriguez had been planning to marry her fiancé the month after her suicide. Dr. David Kim had been mentoring 3 medical students who abandoned their medical careers after his death. Nurse Linda Martinez had been 6 months pregnant when she killed herself. Dr. Robert Johnson had been the single father of a teenage daughter who became suicidal herself after losing him. The dead medical staff's recruitment campaign hadn't just taken 7 lives. It had destroyed families, abandoned dependents, ended promising medical research, and traumatized colleagues. The harm caused by their manipulation far exceeded any benefits from their supernatural medical interventions. Armed with this evidence, I returned to Chicago Memorial Hospital for a final confrontation. I arrived during the night shift and called all 11 dead medical staff members to Trauma Bay 3. I have something to show you, I announced. I spread out the research I had gathered about the 7 medical professionals they had recruited. Dr. Morrison, when you convinced Dr. Sarah Williams to kill herself in 1995, you didn't just gain a supernatural medical practitioner. You left 2 children without a mother. Those children grew up in foster care, and one of them died from a drug overdose at age 17 because he never recovered from his mother's abandonment. Dr. Morrison looked uncomfortable but defiant. Dr. Williams saved hundreds of lives through supernatural medicine. One death to save hundreds is justified. But that's not the complete calculation, I continued. When you convinced Nurse Linda Martinez to kill herself in 2019, you killed her unborn child too. That child might have grown up to become a doctor who saved thousands of lives. You don't know that, Nurse Chen protested. And when you convinced Dr. James Chen to kill himself in 2007, you ended his research into a surgical technique that could have saved thousands of heart patients. His death didn't just take one life, it prevented the saving of thousands of future lives. But I continued through each case, demonstrating how the dead medical staff's recruitment had caused exponentially more harm than their supernatural medicine had prevented. The 7 people you convinced to kill themselves left behind 12 children, 5 spouses, 9 elderly dependents, and 3 revolutionary medical research projects. You didn't just take 7 lives, you destroyed dozens of lives and prevented medical advances that could have saved thousands. The dead medical staff were becoming agitated, their spiritual forms flickering with anger and defensive energy. We saved lives that living medicine couldn't save, Dr. Morrison shouted. How many? I asked. In 30 years of supernatural practice, how many patients have you saved that would have definitely died without your intervention? The dead medical staff looked at each other uncertainly. Hundreds, Nurse Chen claimed. I want exact numbers, I demanded. How many patients did your supernatural medicine save that would have died with only living medical care? After conferring among themselves, Dr. Morrison admitted, perhaps 60 patients over 30 years. 60 patients, I repeated. You convinced 7 people to commit suicide, destroyed dozens of families, ended promising medical research, and traumatized countless colleagues, all to save 60 patients. Those 60 lives matter, Dr. Morrison protested. But they matter less than the hundreds of lives that could have been saved if you hadn't recruited medical professionals away from living practice. I pulled out my final piece of evidence. Dr. Johnson, the trauma surgeon you convinced to kill himself in 2022, was developing a new technique for treating massive bleeding that could save 90% of trauma patients who currently die from blood loss. If he had lived to complete that research, it could save thousands of lives every year. You killed him to gain 1 supernatural medical practitioner who might save 2 or 3 patients per year. The math doesn't work. Your recruitment campaign is causing more deaths than your supernatural medicine prevents. The dead medical staff were silent, their spiritual forms becoming less solid as they processed the implications of what I had shown them. Furthermore, I continued, your manipulation tactics are driving living medical professionals away from emergency medicine entirely. 3 of the nurses you tried to recruit left medicine altogether rather than face your psychological pressure. They could have saved hundreds of lives during their careers, but instead they became teachers and accountants because you made medical practice unbearable for them. Nurse Chen was beginning to fade. We thought we were serving a greater good. You were serving your own addiction to power, I replied. You became so obsessed with transcending the limitations of living medicine that you lost sight of medicine's actual purpose, healing people without causing additional harm. Dr. Morrison was also fading now. But supernatural medicine can achieve things that living medicine never could. And it costs things that living medicine doesn't cost, I finished. The dead can't replace the living. Supernatural abilities can't justify destroying lives and families. One by one, the dead medical staff began to acknowledge the harm they had caused. As they accepted responsibility for the damage their recruitment campaign had created, they began to move on to the afterlife, just as Elizabeth and Emma had done. Dr. Morrison was the last to fade away. Rachel, what will happen to the supernatural medical knowledge we've accumulated? Who will use spiritual healing to save impossible cases? Maybe some knowledge is meant to be lost, I replied. Maybe some power is too dangerous to use even for good purposes. And what about you? Will you continue working at Chicago Memorial? I looked around the trauma bay where I had spent 3 years learning medicine from the dead. No, I think it's time for me to find a new hospital, a new start, somewhere without supernatural complications. Dr. Morrison nodded sadly. Rachel, we were wrong to try to recruit you, but we weren't wrong about your potential. You have exceptional medical abilities, even without supernatural enhancement. How do you know? Because most of what Elizabeth taught you wasn't supernatural knowledge. It was simply excellent medical practice that she had learned through decades of experience. The supernatural elements were minor compared to the fundamentals of good medicine. As Dr. Morrison faded away completely, I realized something that changed my entire perspective on the past 3 years. I hadn't been learning supernatural medicine from Elizabeth's spirit. I had been learning exceptional medicine from a spirit who retained the knowledge and expertise she had gained during her living career. The supernatural elements, the intuition, the ability to sense patients' emotional states, the equipment that responded to spiritual presence. Those had been enhancements, not the foundation of my medical abilities. The foundation had been solid medical knowledge, compassionate patient care, and dedication to healing, all things that could be learned and practiced by living medical professionals. 6 months later, I was working as an emergency nurse at a different hospital in a different city. 6 months later, I was working as an emergency nurse at a different hospital in a different city, using the medical knowledge Elizabeth had taught me to save lives without any supernatural assistance. I discovered that Dr. Morrison had been right. Most of what I had learned from Elizabeth was simply excellent emergency medicine, knowledge that any experienced mentor could have taught me. The supernatural elements had been impressive, but they hadn't been essential. I was saving lives using techniques Elizabeth had shown me, but now I understood that those techniques worked because they were based on sound medical science, not spiritual power. My success rate as a nurse was still excellent, even without supernatural enhancement. But I never forgot the price that supernatural medicine had demanded. 7 medical professionals had killed themselves chasing power that ultimately wasn't necessary for effective healing. Dozens of families had been destroyed by the dead medical staff's recruitment campaign. And I had almost made the same choice, abandoning my life to pursue abilities that, while impressive, weren't worth the cost of death. 3 years after leaving Chicago Memorial Hospital, I received a letter that I had been expecting. Dear Ms. Miller, my name is Dr. Kevin Park, and I'm the new Chief of Emergency Medicine at Chicago Memorial Hospital. I'm writing because we've been experiencing some unusual staffing challenges that I believe you might be able to help us understand. Several of our night shift nurses have reported strange experiences during their shifts. Voices offering medical advice, equipment malfunctions that resolve themselves, and the sensation of being watched by invisible presences. 3 nurses have transferred to other departments rather than continue working night shifts in our ER. I found your contact information in our personnel files with a note that you had experience with unusual circumstances during your time here. Would you be willing to consult with us about these issues? Dr. Kevin Park? I stared at the letter, realizing that new spirits had taken up residence at Chicago Memorial Hospital. The cycle was starting again. New dead medical professionals, possibly attracted by the spiritual energy left behind by the previous supernatural medical staff. New opportunities for living medical professionals to be recruited into supernatural practice. New potential victims who might be manipulated into abandoning their lives for spiritual power. But this time, there was someone who understood what was happening. Someone who had experience with supernatural medical manipulation. Someone who could teach living medical professionals how to resist spiritual recruitment without abandoning medicine entirely. I called Dr. Park that evening. Dr. Park, this is Rachel Miller. I received your letter about unusual experiences at Chicago Memorial. Ms. Miller, thank you for calling. Can you help us understand what our staff is experiencing? Dr. Park, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully. Your hospital is being haunted by dead medical professionals who want to recruit living doctors and nurses to kill themselves and join their supernatural practice. There was a long pause. Ms. Miller, that sounds insane, I know. But Dr. Park, if you don't address this situation immediately, you're going to lose medical staff to suicide, just like Chicago Memorial did 7 times over the past 30 years. What do you mean? I mean that the unusual experiences your staff is reporting are the beginning of a recruitment campaign by dead medical professionals who believe supernatural medicine is superior to living medicine. I spent 2 hours explaining to Dr. C. Park everything I had learned about the supernatural medical staff, their recruitment methods, and the evidence that had convinced them to move on. Ms. Miller, assuming I believe any of this, what do you recommend? I recommend that you hire me as a consultant to train your medical staff on recognizing and resisting supernatural manipulation. What would that training involve? Teaching medical professionals that excellent medicine comes from knowledge, experience, and dedication, not from supernatural enhancement. Teaching them to recognize manipulation tactics, and teaching them that no amount of spiritual power is worth abandoning their lives and families. Dr. Park was quiet for several minutes. Ms. Miller, I don't know if I believe in supernatural medical staff, but I do know that we're losing excellent nurses to psychological stress during night shifts. If you can help our staff handle whatever they're experiencing, I'm willing to try your approach. 2 weeks later, I returned to Chicago Memorial Hospital as a consultant specializing in unusual staff experiences. I couldn't prevent dead medical professionals from appearing in the hospital, but I could teach living medical professionals how to resist their recruitment efforts. I could help medical staff understand that supernatural abilities weren't worth the cost of death, and I could ensure that no one else would be manipulated into abandoning their life for spiritual power. My work at Chicago Memorial became a model for other hospitals experiencing similar supernatural phenomena. Because, as I discovered, Chicago Memorial wasn't unique. Hospitals across the country were dealing with dead medical professionals who had become addicted to supernatural healing and were trying to recruit living practitioners. The medical profession's dedication to saving lives at any cost had created spiritual entities that took that dedication to deadly extremes. But it had also created people like me, medical professionals who understood that the living had responsibilities to the living that couldn't be abandoned for any reason, no matter how noble. Today, I run a consulting practice that helps hospitals address supernatural staff recruitment. I teach medical professionals that excellent medicine comes from human knowledge, human compassion, and human dedication. I help hospital administrators understand that some problems require spiritual solutions, not just administrative policies. And I ensure that medical professionals who encounter supernatural entities have the tools to resist manipulation, while continuing to provide excellent patient care. Because I learned that the most important medical principle isn't about choosing between life and death. It's about choosing life again and again, even when death offers power that life cannot provide. The dead medical staff at Chicago Memorial taught me that healing can become an obsession that transcends death itself. But Elizabeth Santos taught me that the best healing comes from living people who dedicate their lives, not their deaths, to caring for others. Some knowledge is meant to be learned by the living. Some power is meant to be used by people who understand the value of staying alive. And some sacrifices are too great, even for the noble purpose of saving lives. If you work in healthcare, if you've ever been tempted to pursue medical knowledge or abilities at any cost, if you've ever felt that your limitations as a living practitioner make you inadequate, I want you to remember this. The most powerful medicine isn't supernatural. It's human. It's the knowledge that comes from study and experience. It's the compassion that comes from choosing to care for others. It's the dedication that comes from people who value life enough to preserve their own while saving others. The dead can offer power, but only the living can offer hope. And in medicine, hope is often the most powerful treatment of all. Some doors should remain closed, some knowledge should remain lost, and some power should be rejected, no matter how much good it promises to do. Because the cost of supernatural medicine isn't just death. It's the abandonment of everything that makes healing human, compassionate, and ultimately meaningful. The living have responsibilities to the living that no amount of spiritual power can replace. And sometimes the most important choice a medical professional can make is to remain human, limitations and all.